In the 9th century, unknown forgers created a grand deception that changed history. A collection of fake papal decrees, which went down in history as the Decretals of Isidore. For more than 600 years, this forgery remained undiscovered. It became the basis of canon law, determined the outcome of conflicts between popes and emperors, and influenced the fate of entire kingdoms. How was such a large-scale deception possible? Why did the best minds of the Middle Ages fail to notice the forgery? And what happened when the truth finally came out? The story of the greatest ecclesiastical forgery is a story about the power of words, the strength of tradition, and the triumph of critical thinking. If you are interested in medieval history, church secrets, and mysteries of the past, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Now here's a question for discussion in the comments. Can the creators of the Decretals be justified by the fact that they were protecting the church from secular tyranny, or is any deception unacceptable, even for a good cause? Share your opinion. In the middle of the 9th century, the Frankish lands were undergoing turbulent changes. Charlemagne's empire had broken up into warring kingdoms. His grandsons divided his inheritance in bloody wars. In this chaos, the church tried to maintain unity and strengthen its power. Bishops argued with archbishops over the limits of their authority. Secular rulers interfered in church affairs, appointing and dismissing clergy at their discretion. The ancient rules of church governance seemed inadequate for the new challenges. It was during this era that a mysterious document appeared that changed the history of the Christian Church. It was a collection of papal letters and conciliar decisions, supposedly dating back to the early centuries of Christianity. The text was attributed to Isidore of Seville, a famous 7th century Spanish bishop and author of encyclopedic works. However, the real Isidore never compiled such a collection. Therefore, historians named the mysterious compiler Pseudo-Isidore, which means false Isidore. The collection itself was named the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. No one knows for sure who was behind this grandiose forgery. Unknown church lawyers in central France spent years creating documents that were supposed to appear ancient and impeccably authentic. They studied ancient texts, copied the style of early Christian authors, and wove authentic fragments into fictional messages. The result was a large collection of texts covering the first 8 centuries of church history. More than 100 papal decrees, dozens of conciliar acts, and numerous letters from the Holy Fathers. The creators' plan was ambitious. They wanted to rewrite church history so that it would confirm their ideas about the proper structure of the church. In their version, the Roman popes had supreme authority over all bishops from the earliest centuries. Local archbishops did not have the right to judge bishops subordinate to them without the consent of Rome. Secular rulers could not interfere in church affairs or judge clergy. All this contradicted the real history of the early church, but it sounded convincing to people in the 9th century. Why was the forgery so successful? Medieval scholars did not possess the methods of source criticism that seem elementary today. They could not analyze paper or ink. They did not have chronological tables to detect anachronisms. They did not know how Latin had changed over the centuries. If a text looked ancient, contained the correct names and dates, and quoted scripture, it was trusted. And Pseudo-Isidore and his assistants were masters of imitation. Moreover, the content of the Decretals met the pressing needs of the 9th century church. Bishops sought protection from the arbitrariness of archbishops and kings. They needed the authority of antiquity to defend their rights. The new collection gave them just that. By referring to supposedly ancient papal decrees, bishops could appeal to Rome against local metropolitans. They could demand ecclesiastical rather than secular courts. They gained a powerful legal weapon in their struggle for independence. The Decretals quickly spread throughout the Frankish lands. They were copied in monastic scriptoria, quoted at church councils, and included in legal compilations. Already in the middle of the 9th century, Archbishop Ginkmar of Reims encountered them in disputes over ecclesiastical jurisdiction. He realized that he was dealing with a forgery and tried to refute it. But it was too late. The false Isidore's Decretals took root in ecclesiastical law and began their 7th-century journey. How did it happen that the forgery remained undiscovered for so long? Why did the best minds of the Middle Ages not notice the deception? How did the forged documents influence the fates of kings and popes? And what happened when the truth finally came out? To understand this, we need to delve deeper into the history of the creation, dissemination, and exposure of the greatest ecclesiastical forgery of all time. This story is full of dramatic twists, unexpected discoveries, and important lessons about the nature of power, authority, and historical truth. The 9th century was a time when words had enormous power. Written documents, especially ancient ones, had an almost magical authority. In an era when most people could not read, those who controlled the texts controlled knowledge and power. The creators of the pseudo-Isidorian Decretals understood this perfectly well. They created not just a forgery, but an entire alternative version of church history. A version that affirmed ideals close to themselves and many of their contemporaries. It is important to understand the context of the church reforms of that era. After the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, the Frankish church found itself fragmented between warring kingdoms. Bishops depended on local rulers who appointed them and could remove them. Archbishops and metropolitans took advantage of this, strengthening their power over subordinate bishops. Ordinary bishops felt defenseless. They dreamed of a strong central authority that could protect their rights. The Pope could have become such an authority, but in the 9th century, the papacy was not experiencing its best times and did not have any real leverage over the Frankish lands. The Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore provided a legal basis for strengthening papal power. They claimed that since ancient times, the Pope had been the supreme judge in ecclesiastical matters, that no council could be convened without his consent, and that a bishop could appeal to Rome, bypassing his metropolitan. All this radically changed the balance of power in the church. The popes received a theoretical justification for expanding their powers. Bishops gained protection from local arbitrariness, and the church as a whole strengthened its independence from secular power. But the authors of the forgery could not foresee all the consequences of their creation. They did not know that 2 centuries later, their texts would become the basis for a radical restructuring of the church during the Gregorian reform. They did not realize that the Decretals would be cited in disputes between popes and emperors, in conflicts between the church and the state, and in theological discussions about the nature of ecclesiastical authority. They created a tool that turned out to be much more powerful than they had anticipated. And this tool continued to work even after its fraudulent nature was revealed. To understand the scale of the forgery, one must understand what the Decretals were and what role they played in canon law. The Decretals were official letters from the Roman popes containing answers to questions about faith, discipline, and church administration. From the 4th century onwards, such messages became a source of canon law on a par with the decisions of ecumenical councils. The Pope responded to requests from bishops, clarified controversial issues, and resolved conflicts. These responses were collected in compilations and used as precedents in deciding new cases. Church law in the early centuries of Christianity was formed chaotically. There was no single code that was binding on everyone. Each region had its own collections of canons, compiled from the decisions of local councils, epistles of bishops, and fragments of the works of the Church Fathers. When a dispute arose, the parties sought authoritative texts to support their position. The older and more authoritative the source, the greater its weight in the dispute. The epistles of the early popes were considered particularly important, as the Roman Church claimed special status. Few actual ancient decretals have survived. Most of the epistles of the Roman popes of the first centuries have been lost. Only fragments included in various canonical collections have survived to the 9th century. This created an excellent opportunity for falsification. Pseudo-Isidore was free to invent letters on behalf of popes, about whom almost nothing was known. He could put words in their mouths that confirmed the ideas he needed. And no one could verify the authenticity of these texts by referring to the originals. Pseudo-Isidore's collection was a massive undertaking. It contained about 100 fake decretals attributed to popes from the 1st century to the middle of the 8th. To these were added authentic documents from later periods and texts from church councils. The total volume of the collection exceeded 600 pages in modern editions. It was a true canonical code, claiming to be complete and systematic. Any church lawyer could find answers to a wide variety of questions of church administration and discipline in it. The structure of the collection followed a chronological principle. The first part contained texts supposedly relating to the first 3 centuries of Christianity. Here were the epistles of mythical popes, such as Clement and Anacletus, supposedly disciples of the apostles. These texts affirmed the antiquity of papal authority and its apostolic origin. They contained rules of church life, supposedly established in the first decades after Christ. Modern researchers easily find in these texts concepts and problems characteristic of the 9th century, but not of the 1st. The second part included the decretals of the popes of the 4th and 5th centuries, the era of the formation of the Christian Church after its recognition by the Roman Empire. Here, the forgers acted more cautiously, mixing authentic fragments with fictitious ones. They used the names of real popes, included references to well-known councils, and quoted authentic church documents. But in key places, they inserted phrases that expanded papal powers and limited the authority of metropolitans. These insertions were so skillfully done that they could only be detected by careful comparison with the originals. The third part contained texts from the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. Here, the proportion of authentic documents was higher, but they too were distorted. The forgers changed the wording, added entire paragraphs, and reversed the meaning of decisions. They turned the private opinions of individual popes into universal church rules. They attributed ideas that appeared much later to ancient authors. And all this was done so subtly that even experienced church lawyers did not notice the trickery. The falsifiers paid particular attention to issues of church jurisdiction. This was the central theme of the entire collection. Time and again, the fake decretals affirmed the same principles. A bishop can only be judged by a church court. Accusations against a bishop must be confirmed by the testimony of 72 witnesses. No council can judge a bishop without papal permission. A bishop has the right to appeal to the Pope against the decision of the Metropolitan. These provisions were repeated in different formulations dozens of times throughout the collection. Why such insistence? The creators of the decretals understood the psychology of their readers well. They knew that a single mention of a rule could easily be ignored. But if this rule appears in dozens of ancient documents originating from different popes over the centuries, it begins to seem unshakable. Repetition creates the impression of tradition, and tradition was the main source of legitimacy in the medieval consciousness. What had always existed was considered right by definition. The collection also contained many texts on church property. The decretals prohibited secular authorities from confiscating church lands, demanded the return of illegally seized property, and protected church possessions from encroachment. This reflected the real problems of the Frankish Church in the 9th century. Kings and nobles regularly seized church lands, and bishops had no effective means of protection. The forged decrees gave them a legal weapon in the struggle for property. Another important theme of the collection is the relationship between the Church and the state. The false decretals consistently affirmed the independence of the Church from secular authority. Clergy should not be tried in secular courts. Kings cannot convene church councils without papal consent. The appointment of bishops was a matter for the Church, not for secular rulers. These principles were revolutionary for the 9th century, when Frankish kings actively interfered in church affairs. But the decretals presented them as an ancient tradition that needed to be restored. The language of the collection deserves special attention. The forgers tried to imitate the Latin of different eras. For texts from the early centuries, they used archaic phrases and biblical vocabulary. For later documents, the Latin became more complex, reflecting the development of legal language. But words and constructions characteristic of the 9th century slipped into all the texts. Modern philologists easily find these anachronisms, but medieval readers did not notice them. How was the collection distributed? Initially, it probably existed in several handwritten copies created in one place. Then these copies found their way into various monasteries and episcopal residences. Copyists reproduced the text, sometimes adding or changing fragments. By the end of the 9th century, dozens of manuscripts of the pseudo-Isidorian decretals were in libraries throughout Europe. Each copy differed slightly from the others, making it difficult to study the origin of the text. But the main content remained unchanged. Why was the collection attributed to Isidore of Seville? The real Isidore was one of the most respected scholars of the early Middle Ages. His encyclopedic work, Etymologies, served as the main reference book for all branches of knowledge. His authority was unquestionable. By attributing the collection of decretals to him, the forgers automatically gave their creation maximum weight. No one would dare to question a text coming from such a revered father of the Church. It was a brilliant psychological move. The content of the pseudo-Isidore's decretals requires detailed analysis, because it is in the details that the genius of the forgery lies. The creators of the forgery did not simply invent a few documents. They created a coherent system of texts that confirmed itself through numerous cross-references and repeated formulations. Each individual text could have raised doubts, but together they gave the impression of an unbreakable tradition. Let's start with the earliest decretals, attributed to the popes of the 1st and 2nd centuries. Here, the forgers showed particular boldness. They created messages on behalf of popes about whom almost nothing was known. Pope Clement, supposedly the 3rd successor to the Apostle Peter, received a lengthy message about the church hierarchy in the collection. It claimed that Peter himself had established the principle of appeal to the Bishop of Rome, that any Christian could turn to Rome for a fair trial, that the decisions of the Roman throne were binding on the entire church. The real Clement, if he actually existed, lived at the end of the 1st century, when Christianity was a persecuted sect. No developed church structure existed at that time. The concept of appealing to the Bishop of Rome could not have arisen in those days. But the creators of the Decretals projected the realities of the 9th century onto the 1st. They described the early church as they wanted to see the church of their own time. And this projection proved convincing to medieval readers. Pope Anacletus, the mythical successor to Clement, was credited with a letter on the rights of bishops. The text asserted that a bishop was equal to a king in his diocese, that no one could judge a bishop except his fellow bishops, and that accusations against a bishop had to be confirmed by numerous witnesses. These provisions were then repeated in dozens of other decretals. The forgers put the same ideas into the mouths of different popes, creating the illusion of an unchanging tradition. Of particular interest are the forged texts attributed to the popes of the 4th century. This was the time of Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, and the formation of the state church. The real popes of this era did indeed strengthen the authority of the Roman See. But the false Isidore's decretals attributed to them much more radical statements than they ever made. Pope Julius III was credited with a letter prohibiting the convening of councils without Roman consent. Pope Damasus was attributed with decrees on the inadmissibility of secular courts over the clergy. The forgers skillfully mixed truth with fiction. They took real historical events and distorted their meaning. For example, the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD did indeed establish important church rules. But in the pseudo-Isidore's decretals, these rules were presented in a distorted form. The authentic canons of Nicaea spoke of the role of metropolitans in church administration. The fake version downplayed the power of metropolitans and emphasized the importance of papal authority. The collection contained many texts on the property rights of the church. This was a sore point for the Frankish church of the 9th century. The secularization of church lands by kings and nobles had become widespread. Bishops were losing the economic basis of their power. The false Isidore's decretals presented the protection of church property as an ancient commandment. Message after message condemned the seizure of church lands, demanded the return of what had been taken, and threatened violators with ecclesiastical punishment. Pope Stephen III was credited with a letter prohibiting lay people from owning church property. Pope Felix II was credited with a decree on the inalienability of lands granted to the church. Pope Anastasius I was credited with rules for the inheritance of church property. All these texts were pure fiction, but they created the impression of an ancient and consistent tradition of protecting church wealth, a tradition that needed to be restored in the 9th century. The central theme of the collection was legal proceedings. It was here that the forgers showed the greatest ingenuity. They created a complex system of rules governing the trial of bishops. These rules were designed to make it as difficult as possible to convict a bishop and to protect him from the arbitrariness of metropolitans and secular authorities. 72 witnesses of impeccable reputation were required to convict a bishop. A bishop could not be removed from office until the investigation was complete. He had the right to appeal to the Pope at any stage of the process. Where did the number 72 come from? It was a reference to the Old Testament texts, where 70 elders were elected as Moses' assistants. Falsifiers loved such biblical allusions. They gave their fabrications a veneer of sacred antiquity. In reality, the requirement of 72 witnesses was absurd. It was almost impossible to find that many people willing to testify against a bishop, which was exactly what needed to be proven. Bishops were granted de facto immunity from prosecution. The collection also contained many texts about church councils. The Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore claimed that no council, provincial or national, could be convened without papal permission, that the decisions of councils had to be approved in Rome, that the Pope could overturn any council decision. These provisions radically changed the traditional view of the conciliarity of the Church. In reality, early councils were convened by emperors or metropolitans. Popes often did not even attend them. But the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore rewrote this history. It is interesting how the forgers circumvented obvious contradictions with known facts. When real history too clearly contradicted their version, they resorted to vague wording. They spoke of exceptions caused by extraordinary circumstances. They referred to lost documents that supposedly confirmed their correctness. They used legal jargon that obscured the meaning. All this created an impression of depth and erudition that deterred critics. Some of the texts in the collection were almost entirely authentic, but with critical insertions. For example, the famous Donation of Constantine was included in the Pseudo-Isidore's Decretals. This was another forged document, probably created in the 8th century in Rome. According to it, Emperor Constantine transferred power over the western part of the Roman Empire to Pope Sylvester. The donation was as fake as the Decretals, but the 9th century forgers used it to strengthen their position. They surrounded it with texts that confirmed and developed its ideas. The style of the Decretals is varied, but the hand of experienced church lawyers is evident throughout. The texts are replete with references to the Bible, especially the Old Testament. The forgers liked to draw parallels between the Christian Church and ancient Israel. Bishops were compared to Old Testament high priests. The Pope was presented as a new Moses. These analogies were familiar to the medieval mind and did not arouse suspicion. Many decretals contain curses and anathemas against violators of church rules, those who judge bishops unlawfully, those who seize church property, those who disobey papal decrees. All are declared excommunicated from the church and doomed to eternal torment. These threats were a standard part of medieval church texts. They gave the documents additional weight. Who would want to risk the salvation of their soul by violating ancient papal decrees? To understand the motives of the creators of the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, it is necessary to immerse oneself in the ecclesiastical and political realities of the 9th century. The Frankish Church was in deep crisis. After the death of Charlemagne in 814, his empire began to fall apart. The sons and grandsons of the great emperor waged endless wars over the division of the inheritance. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 formally divided the empire into 3 kingdoms, but the conflicts continued. The Church found itself hostage to the political games of secular rulers. Kings regarded bishops as their officials. They appointed their protégés to bishoprics, often people who lacked the proper education and piety. They removed unwelcome bishops, confiscated church lands, and interfered in church proceedings. Ordinary bishops felt defenseless in the face of royal arbitrariness, but it was not only kings who threatened the independence of bishops. Within the church itself, power was concentrated in the hands of archbishops and metropolitans. Metropolitans ruled over ecclesiastical provinces, which included several bishoprics. They had the right to convene provincial councils, judge conflicts between bishops, and control the election of new bishops. With the weakening of central imperial power, the metropolitans strengthened their autonomy. They became local ecclesiastical monarchs, before whom ordinary bishops were practically powerless. The creators of the pseudo-Isidore Decretals saw a way out in strengthening papal power. A strong pope with real authority over the entire Western Church could become a counterweight to both kings and metropolitans. Bishops suffering from local arbitrariness could appeal to him. He could defend church rights and independence. But in the 9th century, the papacy did not have such powers. The Roman popes were influential bishops, but not absolute monarchs of the Church. The task of the forgers was to create a legal basis for such an absolute papal monarchy. They could not change the present, but they could rewrite the past. If they could prove that popes had held supreme authority in the Church since ancient times, this would be an argument for its restoration in the present. The False Decretals of Isidore were an attempt at such a rewriting of history. The first goal of the forgers was to protect bishops from the arbitrariness of metropolitans. Dozens of texts in the collection are devoted to limiting metropolitan power. A metropolitan cannot judge a bishop of his province alone. He must convene a council of all the bishops of the province. Even the decision of the council can be appealed in Rome. The metropolitan cannot remove a bishop from office without the pope's permission. He cannot confiscate the property of the bishopric. He cannot interfere in the internal affairs of the dioceses. These rules radically change the balance of power. The metropolitan was transformed from a superior into the first among equals. Real power passed to the bishops, who could ignore the metropolitan's demands by invoking their right to appeal to the pope. It is understandable why many bishops enthusiastically welcomed the new decretals. They gave them a weapon in their struggle against metropolitans who often abused their power. The second goal was to limit the interference of secular authorities in church affairs. The decretals of Pseudo-Isidore consistently affirmed the principle of the independence of the Church from the state. Clergy are not subject to secular courts. The king cannot judge a bishop or priest. If a clergyman is accused of a crime, he must be judged by an ecclesiastical court. Only the Church can punish its ministers. This principle was revolutionary for the 9th century. In the Carolingian Empire, clergy were regularly tried in royal courts. Kings considered themselves entitled to punish offending bishops. The Church and the state were closely intertwined. The falsifiers proposed to separate them. They wanted to create the Church as an independent legal entity, inaccessible to secular authorities. The third goal was to protect church property. It was a matter of survival for many bishoprics. Kings and nobles seized church lands under various pretexts. Sometimes these were confiscations as punishment for disobedience. Sometimes it was simply robbery, covered up by legal formalities. Bishops lost their economic base and became financially dependent on secular authorities. The Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore declared church property sacred and inviolable. Whoever seizes church lands robs Christ himself. Church donations cannot be taken back. The king has no right to dispose of church property. These principles were repeated dozens of times in the collection. The creators of the Decretals understood that the issue of property concerned the bishops no less than issues of jurisdiction. The fourth goal was to centralize church administration. The forgers wanted to turn the church into a unified hierarchical system with the Pope at its head. All important decisions were to be made in Rome or with its approval. Provincial councils could only meet with papal permission. Their decisions required Roman approval. The appointment of bishops was to be controlled by the Pope. Even the election of metropolitans was to be coordinated with Rome. Such centralization contradicted the actual practice of the early church, where local churches enjoyed considerable autonomy. But the forgers portrayed it as an ancient tradition that had been lost due to negligence and sin. The restoration of papal power was presented as a return to forgotten ideals, not as an innovation. The fifth goal was to strengthen discipline within the church. The False Isidore's Decretals introduced strict rules of conduct for the clergy. Bishops and priests were to lead an ascetic lifestyle, avoid worldly pursuits, and devote themselves to church service. Violators were subject to ecclesiastical court and could be defrocked. These requirements reflected the reformist ideals of part of the Frankish clergy. Interestingly, the creators of the Decretals did not call for the immediate application of all these rules. They understood that a radical restructuring of church relations was impossible. Their task was to create a legal foundation on which future reformers could build. And this calculation proved correct. 2 centuries later, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore became the main weapon of the Gregorian reform. Who exactly was behind the creation of the forgery? This question has not yet been definitively resolved. Most researchers believe that the authors were church lawyers from the circle of Archbishop Hincmar of Reims. The irony is that Hincmar himself was a powerful metropolitan, against whose authority the Decretals were directed. Perhaps his opponents among the subordinate bishops created this text as a weapon against him. Another version links the creation of the collection to Bishop Rotad of Soissons, who had a long-standing conflict with Hincmar. Rotad was removed from his see and appealed to the Pope. Perhaps it was he or his supporters who created the Decretals to justify their right to appeal. But this is only a hypothesis. The authors of the forgery managed to conceal their names, and the mystery of their identities will probably remain unsolved. It is important to understand that the forgers did not consider themselves deceivers in the modern sense. In their view, they were not inventing new rules, but restoring forgotten truths. Medieval consciousness allowed for such pious lies. If a text served a good purpose, protecting the church, strengthening faith, fighting injustice, then its authenticity was not so important. Truth was understood not as conformity to fact, but as conformity to a higher purpose. This logic explains why the Decretals were so easily accepted by many contemporaries. People believed not because they had carefully checked the facts. They believed because the content of the texts corresponded to their ideas about the proper structure of the church. In an era when the distinction between history and myth was blurred, such belief seemed natural. The methods used to create the pseudo-Isidorian decretals are admirable in their sophistication. The forgers were not amateurs. They possessed a deep knowledge of church history, Latin, and legal techniques. They understood how the medieval mind worked, what arguments seemed convincing, and what details lent credibility to a text. Their methods were so perfect that the forgery remained undiscovered for more than 600 years. The first method was to imitate the style of ancient texts. The forgers carefully studied authentic documents from earlier centuries. They noted characteristic turns of phrase, typical formulations, and methods of argumentation. Then they copied these features in their forgeries. For the epistles of the early centuries, they used simple Latin with biblical vocabulary. For documents from the 4th and 5th centuries, the Latin became more complex, approaching the language of the church councils of that era. They understood that each era had its own linguistic style. But despite all their skill, the forgers could not avoid anachronisms. Words and concepts that did not exist at the supposed time of the document's creation slipped into their texts. They used legal terms that only appeared in the 8th or 9th century. They described church institutions that arose much later than the attributed date. Modern philologists easily find these errors, but medieval readers did not notice them. The lack of a critical method of text analysis was the forger's main ally. The second method was the use of authentic fragments. The forgers did not compose everything from scratch. They took real texts and reworked them to suit their needs. An authentic papal letter could be expanded by adding new paragraphs. A real conciliar decision was reworded to change its meaning. Biblical quotations were woven into the text, creating an aura of sacred authority. This collage technique made the forgery difficult to detect. When authentic fragments are present in the text, it becomes virtually impossible to check every word. They were particularly fond of using the Holy Scriptures. Almost every decretal contained numerous biblical quotations and allusions. This was a standard technique of medieval rhetoric, but the forgers used it with particular skill. They selected texts from the Bible that could be interpreted in favor of their ideas. Christ's words about the Apostle Peter as the rock on which the church was built were used to justify papal authority. Old Testament rules about high priests were applied to bishops. Biblical quotations gave human institutions divine authority. The third method was the creation of cross-references. The falsifiers understood that a single document could easily be questioned. But if dozens of documents refer to each other, confirming and developing the same ideas, it creates the impression of a system. They put the same words into the mouths of different popes. They forced later popes to quote their predecessors. They created the appearance of tradition through repetition. Each new text reinforced the credibility of the previous ones. The fourth method was the use of sources that could not be verified. Falsifiers often referred to documents that supposedly existed but had been lost. No one could verify whether such a message actually existed. Most ancient archives were indeed destroyed during the barbarian invasions of the 5th and 6th centuries. Referring to a non-existent source seemed plausible. In an era of limited access to information, this tactic worked flawlessly. The fifth method was the creation of plausible details. Forgers included in their texts the names of real historical figures, the names of real places, and the dates of real events. Pope Clement sends a message to the Christians of Corinth. This corresponds to the known fact of the existence of an early community in Corinth. Pope Julius mentions the council in Sardica. Such a council did indeed take place in 343. These details created the illusion of historical authenticity. Real facts were supplemented with fictional details that could not be verified. The sixth method was to use the authority of Isidore of Seville. By attributing the collection to this revered 7th century scholar, the forgers automatically gave it enormous weight. Isidore was the author of the famous Etymologies, an encyclopedia that was studied in all monastic schools. His works on canon law enjoyed unquestionable authority. No one would have thought to doubt the authenticity of a text associated with his name. It was a brilliant psychological move that ensured the forgery's credibility for centuries to come. The seventh method was adaptation to the needs of readers. The content of the Decretals met the real needs of the bishops of the 9th century. Protection from the arbitrariness of metropolitans, limiting secular interference, preserving church property. All these were pressing problems for the church of that era. The forgers did not simply deceive, they offered solutions to real difficulties. This made their creation in demand and protected it from critical scrutiny. People believe in what serves their interests and confirms their beliefs. The eighth method was the exploitation of piety and fear of sin. Medieval people were deeply religious. To doubt the authenticity of ancient papal messages seemed sacrilegious. The forgers surrounded their texts with an aura of sacredness. They filled them with prayers, blessings, and curses against violators of church rules. Each decretal ended with an anathema against those who dared to disobey the established norms. Who would dare to question words sealed with the names of holy popes and the threat of eternal damnation? The ninth method was the use of complex legal language. The Decretals were written in the specialized Latin language of canon law. This deterred the uninitiated and created an impression of depth and erudition. Long sentences full of subordinate clauses, confusing constructions, and lots of legal terms made the texts hard to understand for the average reader. Only educated church lawyers could figure them out, and these experts had a vested interest in the Decretals being authentic because they gave them extra tools of power. The 10th method was gradual dissemination and adaptation. The forgers did not release their collection all at once. Initially, it appeared in a limited circle of ecclesiastical lawyers, probably in northeastern France. Then it gradually spread through monastic scriptoria. Copyists sometimes made changes, added local details, and adapted the texts to regional conditions. This created the impression of an organic development of tradition, rather than a one-time falsification. By the time the collection became widely distributed, its origin could no longer be accurately determined. It is important to understand the psychology of the medieval attitude toward written sources. For people of that era, the antiquity of a text was the main criterion of authenticity. The older the document, the more it was trusted. The idea of historical development, of ideas changing over time, was foreign to medieval thinking. It was believed that truth always existed in an unchanging form. The task of the scholar was to find ancient evidence of this truth, not to criticize it. Falsifiers exploited this very mindset. In addition, medieval culture was a culture of authority. What was confirmed by references to recognized authors was considered true. Personal opinions that were not supported by the authority of the ancients carried no weight. The false Isidore's Decretals created a whole chain of authorities that confirmed each other. Each pope referred to his predecessors. Each text quoted Scripture and the Holy Fathers. This system of mutual confirmation seemed irrefutable. The place and time of creation of the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals have long been a subject of controversy among historians. Today, most researchers agree that the collection was created in the middle of the 9th century in the Frankish kingdom, most likely in the region between Reims and Mainz. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact location of its creation, as the authors carefully concealed their origins. However, some details in the text point to the Frankish lands as the birthplace of the forgery. The time of creation can be determined more confidently, approximately between 847 and 853. The lower limit is set by the latest authentic document included in the collection. This is a letter from Pope Gregory IV, who died in 844. The upper limit is determined by the first reliable mention of the Decretals in other sources, which dates back to the mid-850s. Thus, work on the collection took several years at the end of the reign of Emperor Lothair I and at the beginning of the turbulent period after his death. Why was this particular time favorable for creating a forgery? The Frankish Empire was in deep crisis. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 formally divided Charlemagne's empire between the emperor's three grandsons. Lothair received Italy and the central lands, Louis received eastern Francia, and Charles the Bald received western Francia. But the borders were unclear, and conflicts continued. The Church found itself torn between the warring kingdoms and needed a new foundation for unity. It was during these years that the famous conflict between Archbishop Ginkmar of Reims and his subordinate bishops flared up. Ginkmar was one of the most influential church figures of his time. He participated in the coronation of kings, determined the church policy of the West Frankish kingdom, and was an advisor to Charles the Bald. But his authoritarian style of management provoked resistance from his subordinate bishops. They sought ways to limit his power and protect their rights. Bishop Rotad of Soissons became Ginkmar's main opponent. In 852, Ginkmar succeeded in having Rotad deposed at a church council. Rotad refused to recognize the council's decision and appealed to Pope Nicholas III. This was a precedent-setting case. Until then, Frankish bishops rarely appealed directly to Rome, bypassing their metropolitans. Rotad needed legal justification for his right to appeal, and just at that time, a collection appeared that provided such justification. Many historians believe that the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore were created in the circle of Rotad or other bishops who were in conflict with Ginkmar. The collection was a weapon in their struggle against the powerful archbishop. It gave them legal arguments to defend their rights. It allowed them to refer to ancient papal decrees that affirmed the bishop's right to appeal to Rome. It was not an abstract scientific work, but a practical tool in a specific political struggle. However, the creation of such a large-scale collection required not only motivation, but also opportunities. A rich library with ancient manuscripts that could be studied and copied was needed. A group of educated church lawyers who knew Latin and were familiar with canon law was needed. Time and a quiet place for many years of work were also needed. All this points to a large monastery or bishop's residence as the place where the forgery was created. Researchers name several possible centers: One of the candidates is the monastery of Corbie in Picardy, known for its rich library and scriptorium. Another is Reims, where Ginkmar had his residence and where a group of his opponents was active. The third is Mainz, an important ecclesiastical center in eastern Francia. Each of these locations has its supporters, but there is no definitive clarity. Perhaps the authors deliberately concealed their place of work by creating manuscripts in different locations. Who exactly were these authors? Their names have not been preserved. We only know that they were highly qualified ecclesiastical lawyers. They had to be proficient in Latin to the extent that they could imitate the style of different eras. They had to know church history in order to use names, dates, and events correctly. They had to be familiar with the technique of compiling canonical collections. All this points to people who had received a good education in a monastery or cathedral school. The work was probably carried out by a group. One person would not have been able to create a collection of this size in a few years. They needed assistance to search for materials, transcribe texts, and check quotations. The group could have consisted of 3 to 5 people working under the guidance of an editor-in-chief. They divided the tasks among themselves. One dealt with texts from the 1st centuries, another with those from the 4th and 5th centuries, and a third collected authentic documents from later periods. An important question is whether the authors knew they were creating a forgery. To modern people, this seems obvious, but the medieval mind allowed for a more flexible attitude toward authorship and authenticity. Perhaps the creators of the Decretals sincerely believed that they were restoring a lost truth. They may have believed that the ancient popes really taught what they attributed to them, but that the texts had simply not survived. Their task was to reconstruct these lost teachings on the basis of logic and church tradition. Such logic was typical of medieval culture. The concepts of intellectual property and plagiarism in the modern sense did not exist. Attributing one's ideas to ancient authorities was considered normal and even commendable. It was a way to give weight to one's thoughts, not a form of deception. If your ideas are true, it does not matter whose name you use to express them. The essence is important, not the form. From this point of view, the creators of the Decretals may not have felt like they were falsifiers. The working method probably looked like this. First, a general plan for the collection was drawn up with a list of the necessary topics and periods. Then all available authentic documents were collected: papal encyclicals, conciliar acts, fragments from the works of the Church Fathers. These texts were studied, and useful phrases and expressions were extracted from them. Based on this material, new texts were created that imitated the style of the ancients. The authentic was mixed with the fictitious in such a way that it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. The texts were copied onto parchment by specially trained scribes. Carolingian minuscule was used, the standard font of the Charlemagne era, which made reading easier. Decretals were copied in the form of codices, books made of bound sheets of parchment rather than scrolls. This was a modern format for the 9th century, but it had to appear ancient, as codices had been used by Christians since the early centuries. The binding was made of wooden boards covered with leather. The first copies of the collection were probably luxuriously decorated. Initials were adorned with ornamentation, and important phrases were highlighted in red ink. This gave the manuscripts the appearance of important official documents. Copies were then made from these copies and distributed to monasteries and bishoprics. Each copyist could make small changes and add local details, which created the illusion of multiple independent sources. The authors of the forgery could not have foreseen the impact their creation would have. They were solving specific problems of their time without thinking about the centuries ahead. But the tool they created proved so powerful and versatile that it outlived its creators by many centuries. The False Decretals became the foundation of medieval canon law, influenced the development of papal power, and played a role in the greatest conflicts between church and state. What was the further fate of this mysterious collection? How did it spread throughout Europe and become part of church administration practice? Why were even critics like Ginkmar unable to stop its triumphant march? The spread of the Pseudo-Isidore's Decretals was surprisingly rapid. By the end of the 850s, the collection was known in various parts of the Frankish kingdom. The first reliable mention dates back to 857, when some provisions of the Decretals were used in ecclesiastical political disputes. By 860, the collection was being quoted at church councils. By the end of the century, it had become one of the main sources of ecclesiastical law in the Frankish lands. How was this possible? The medieval system of distributing books was slow and laborious. Each copy had to be transcribed by hand, which took months of work. Parchment was an expensive material. The services of professional copyists cost a considerable amount of money. Nevertheless, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore were reproduced faster than most other texts of the time. This indicates that there was a high demand for the collection. Bishops who received a copy of the Decretals immediately appreciated their usefulness. The collection provided them with legal arguments in disputes with metropolitans and secular authorities. It allowed them to refer to ancient authorities in defense of their rights. Bishops ordered copies for their chancelleries, recommended it to their colleagues, and quoted it at councils. The Decretals were distributed not by order from above, but on the initiative of those below, which made their dissemination organic and rapid. Monasteries played a key role in the reproduction of the text. Large monastic scriptoria produced copies to order for bishops and for their own needs. The copyists did not suspect that they were working with a forgery. For them, it was just another canonical collection attributed to the authoritative Isidore of Seville. They diligently copied the text, sometimes adding local material or correcting obvious errors. Thus, the collection gradually changed, acquiring regional characteristics. Interestingly, the first person to publicly question the authenticity of the Decretals was Ginkmar of Reims himself. The powerful archbishop quickly realized that the new collection threatened his authority. In 858, he wrote a critical treatise pointing out contradictions in the Decretals and inconsistencies with authentic ancient texts. Ginkmar had extensive knowledge of church history and was able to notice anachronisms invisible to most of his contemporaries. But Ginkmar's criticism had no effect. His opponents accused the archbishop of trying to protect his excessive powers. They claimed that Ginkmar rejected the ancient texts because they contradicted his ambitions. Psychologically, this was a winning position. Ginkmar was acting against the interests of most bishops, and they preferred to believe the decrees rather than his criticism. Personal motives discredited well-founded doubts. Moreover, Ginkmar was unable to convincingly prove the falsity of the texts. He did not have the methods of textual criticism that would only appear in the 15th century. He could point out contradictions and oddities, but he could not conclusively prove falsification. And in the absence of evidence, the medieval mind preferred to trust antiquity and authority. Isidore of Seville was a recognized authority, while Ginkmar was a controversial figure. The choice was a foregone conclusion. Pope Nicholas I, to whom Bishop Rotad appealed, used the false Isidore's Decretals in his decisions. This was a turning point. When the Roman high priest recognized the collection as authentic and began to refer to it, doubts about its authenticity became virtually impossible. Who would dare to claim that the Pope was wrong about matters of church history? The authority of Rome cemented the success of the forgery. Nicholas was one of the most energetic and influential popes of the 9th century. He actively intervened in the affairs of the Frankish and German churches, defended papal prerogatives, and clashed with emperors and kings. The false decretals of Isidore perfectly matched his policy. They justified precisely those powers that Nicholas was trying to implement in practice. It is not surprising that he accepted them without hesitation and used them as a weapon in the struggle to expand papal power. In 863, at the Council of Metz, the Decretals were officially recognized as an authoritative source of law. The council was considering yet another conflict between bishops and metropolitans. Both sides referred to the pseudo-Isidore Decretals to defend their positions. This very use confirmed the authenticity of the collection. If everyone cites the same source as authoritative, then it is indeed authoritative. This is how the logic of collective recognition works. By the end of the 9th century, the Decretals of pseudo-Isidore had spread not only to Frankish lands, but also to Italy, Germany, and Spain. Wherever there were conflicts between bishops and metropolitans, between the church and the state, the collection found grateful readers. It was translated into local Latin dialects, supplemented with regional materials, and commented on by local lawyers. Many versions of the text appeared, making it difficult to find the original and establish authorship. In the 10th century, an era of decline in papal power and feudal fragmentation, the Decretals temporarily faded into the background. The Church was undergoing a severe crisis. The popes of Rome became puppets of local aristocratic families. Bishops turned into feudal lords, more concerned with wars than spiritual matters. Few people were interested in questions of canon law, but the collection was preserved in monastic libraries, waiting for its moment. That moment came in the 11th century with the beginning of the Gregorian reform. Pope Gregory VII and his supporters embarked on a radical restructuring of the Church. They wanted to free the Church from the control of secular authorities, strengthen the discipline of the clergy, and centralize administration under the authority of Rome. To justify their reforms, they needed legal arguments, and they found them in the Decretals of pseudo-Isidore. The collection was rescued from oblivion and given a new lease on life. The reformers quoted the Decretals in their treatises, used them in polemics with their opponents, and included them in new canonical collections. The famous Decree of Gratian, created around 1140 and which became the basis of medieval ecclesiastical law, included many texts from the pseudo-Isidore Decretals. Through Gratian's decree, the forged texts entered the teaching of canon law in universities. Thus, a 9th century forgery became the foundation of a legal system that lasted until the 16th century. Generations of church lawyers studied it, commented on it, and applied it in practice. The Decretals were quoted in papal bulls, in the decisions of ecclesiastical courts, and in theological treatises. They became part of a tradition that seemed eternal and unshakable. Ginkmar's criticism was forgotten. No one questioned their authenticity anymore. The paradox is that the success of the forgery was due not so much to its quality as to the demand for its ideas. People believed in the Decretals not because they had carefully verified their authenticity, but because they wanted to believe in them. The content of the collection corresponded to their ideas about what the Church should be. In an era when wishful thinking was easily mistaken for reality, the forgery was accepted as truth. The dissemination of the text was not simply a matter of mechanical copying. It was a process of cultural transmission, during which the ideas of the 9th century became the common property of the European Church. Every copyist, every reader, every lawyer who used the Decretals contributed to their dissemination and recognition. The forgery became a collective creation of many generations. The influence of the pseudo-Isidorian Decretals on the development of canon law cannot be overestimated. For 7 centuries, from the 9th to the 16th century, this collection remained one of the main sources of canon law in the Catholic Church. Tens of thousands of legal decisions were based on its provisions. Hundreds of canonical collections included texts from the Decretals. University professors taught them as an indisputable ancient tradition. Popes referred to them in their bulls. Ecclesiastical courts applied them in their daily practice. The first major canonical collection to make extensive use of the Decretals was the work of Burchard of Worms, created around 1018. Burchard, bishop of the German city of Worms, compiled an extensive collection of church rules called the Decretum. He collected thousands of texts from various sources, systematized them by topic, and provided commentary. Much of the material was borrowed from the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore, although Burchard did not always indicate the source. Burchard's work was widely distributed in Germany and became the basis for the training of ecclesiastical lawyers. Through it, the ideas of Pseudo-Isidore penetrated the German Church and became established in legal practice. Students who studied Burchard's Decretum accepted the provisions of the Decretals as indisputable truth. They became bishops, judges, and advisors to princes and carried these ideas forward. Thus, a tradition based on forgery was created, but the real triumph of the Decretals came in the 12th century with the appearance of Gratian's Decretum. Around 1140, the monk lawyer Gratian of Bologna created a monumental work entitled Harmonization of Disagreeing Canons. It was an attempt to systematize all ecclesiastical law, eliminate contradictions between different sources, and create a coherent legal system. Gratian included a huge number of texts in his work, including many fragments from the Pseudo-Isidore's Decretals. Gratian's decree became the main textbook on canon law in medieval universities. All law students studied it for several years. Professors wrote commentaries on it, which themselves became authoritative sources. An entire science emerged, canon law, based on the study of the decree. And since a significant part of the decree came from the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore, the fake texts became the foundation of medieval legal science. The University of Bologna, where Gratian taught and where his work was studied, became the main center of canon law in Europe. Students from all over the Catholic world came there to study. They returned home with a doctorate in canon law and took up high positions in the church administration. They became papal legates, episcopal vicars, and judges of ecclesiastical tribunals, and everywhere they applied the knowledge they had gained from Gratian's Decretum, and thus from the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. The papal curia actively used the Decretals to justify its claims to power. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the papacy fought fiercely for independence from secular power and for primacy in the Christian world. Its main opponents were the German emperors, who claimed control over the Church. The popes needed legal arguments to defend their positions. The Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore provided such arguments in abundance. Pope Gregory VII, who began a radical reform of the Church in 1073, relied on the Decretals in his most important documents. His famous papal dictate, a list of 27 provisions affirming the absolute power of the Roman high priest, echoed ideas expressed in the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals. The Pope can depose bishops. No one can judge the Pope. The Pope could overturn the decisions of any council. The Roman Church had never been wrong and never would be. All these theses were based on forged texts from the 9th century. Gregory's conflict with the German Emperor Henry IV, known as the Investiture controversy, was largely conducted in the language of canon law. Both sides referred to ancient texts to prove their case. Gregory quoted the Decretals, which affirmed the independence of the Church from secular authority. Henry referred to other sources that confirmed the emperor's right to appoint bishops. But in the end, the papal position, based on the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore, prevailed. The Concordat of Worms of 1122, which ended the investiture controversy, was a compromise, but a compromise in favor of the Church. The emperor renounced his right to appoint bishops, retaining only the right to participate in their election. The Church established its independence in spiritual matters. This outcome would have been impossible without the legal foundation created by the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. A 9th century forgery determined the outcome of a 12th century conflict. In the 13th century, the influence of the Decretals reached its peak. Popes Innocent III and Innocent IV took the papacy's claims to power to unprecedented heights. They claimed that the Pope was Christ's representative on earth, possessing full spiritual and secular authority. They deposed emperors, excommunicated kings, and disposed of crowns. The legal basis for these claims was, among other things, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. Medieval ecclesiastical courts widely applied the provisions of the Decretals. The rules on the trial of clergy were particularly important. According to the Decretals, only a church court could judge a bishop. Numerous witnesses were required for an accusation. The accused had the right to appeal to the Pope. These rules made it virtually impossible to convict corrupt or criminal priests. They created a system of ecclesiastical privileges that caused outrage among secular authorities and the common people. University professors of canon law wrote extensive commentaries on the texts of the Decretals. These commentaries, called glosses, filled the margins of the manuscripts of Gratian's Decretals. Some glosses were brief explanations of terms. Others were detailed legal arguments. The most authoritative commentaries were included in subsequent editions of the Decretum and became part of the canonical tradition themselves. Thus, an entire industry of legal scholarship grew up around the forged texts. Generations of scholars spent their lives studying, commenting on, and applying texts created by unknown forgers in the 9th century. They were unaware of the forgery and sincerely believed that they were studying the ancient wisdom of the Church. Their conscientious work lent authenticity to the forgery and strengthened its authority. By the 14th century, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore had become so integrated into canon law that it was impossible to separate them from the authentic ancient texts. They were quoted by popes in bulls, included in official collections of church laws, and taught in universities as indisputable truth. Any attempt to challenge their authenticity would have been met with incomprehension. Why question texts that had been recognized as authoritative for centuries? The influence of the Decretals extended far beyond the purely legal sphere. They shaped ideas about the nature of the Church, the relationship between spiritual and secular power, and the rights of individuals within the Church. The idea of the Church as a hierarchical system headed by the Pope, a church independent of the state, a church with its own legal system. All this was largely created, or at least reinforced, by the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. Paradoxically, the forgery had a real positive impact on the development of law. The Decretals protected the rights of the accused, demanded fair trials, and limited the arbitrariness of power. Yes, they created excessive privileges for the clergy, but they also affirmed the principles of the rule of law, the presumption of innocence, the right to defense, and the prohibition of arbitrariness. These principles, although based on lies, became part of the European legal tradition. It can be said that the Pseudo-Isidore's Decretals were one of the tools with which medieval Europe created a legal society. Of course, this society was far from modern standards, but compared to the barbaric customs of the early Middle Ages, it was a significant step forward. And this progress was based, paradoxically, on a carefully fabricated lie. The Gregorian reform of the 11th century became the heyday of the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. What was created as a local weapon in Frankish church disputes became the ideological basis for a global transformation of the Church. Pope Gregory VII, elected in 1073, conceived a radical restructuring of the church system. He wanted to free the Church from the control of secular power, eradicate simony and Nicolaitanism, and establish the unconditional supremacy of Rome over the entire Western Church. Simony, the sale of church offices, was the scourge of the medieval Church. Bishoprics and abbeys became lucrative positions that kings and princes distributed to their supporters in exchange for money or military service. Many bishops were poorly educated warriors who were interested in the church only as a source of income. Nicolaitanism, the violation of celibacy by priests, was no less widespread. Many priests lived in open cohabitation, passed on church property to their children, turning the priesthood into a hereditary profession. Gregory VII decided to put an end to these abuses, but radical reforms required a radical strengthening of papal power. Only a strong pope could force kings to stop selling bishoprics and compel bishops to reform their clergy. It was necessary to prove that the pope had absolute power in the church, that no one could oppose him, that his word was law for all Christians. And here, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore came to the rescue. In 1075, Gregory issued his famous papal dictate, 27 Theses on papal power. Almost all of them had direct or indirect analogies in the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. Only the Roman Church is founded by God. Only the Roman high priest can be called universal. Only he can depose and reinstate bishops. No one can overturn his decisions. He can judge everyone, but he himself is not subject to judgment. He can depose emperors. Gregory presented these radical positions as ancient tradition, relying on the authority of forged decrees. Conflict with the German Emperor Henry IV was inevitable. Henry, like his predecessors, considered himself entitled to appoint bishops in his lands. This was an important part of imperial power. Bishops were not only spiritual pastors, but also major feudal lords who controlled significant territories. To relinquish control over them meant weakening imperial power. But Gregory declared the practice of secular investiture of bishops to be sinful and prohibited it under threat of excommunication. Henry initially tried to resist. In 1076, he convened a council of German bishops in Worms, which declared Gregory deposed. The bishops accused the Pope of illegally seizing the throne, tyranny, and violating church customs. But Gregory responded by excommunicating the emperor from the church and freeing his subjects from their oath of allegiance. This was an unprecedented step. Never before had a pope dared to depose the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The legal basis for this extraordinary action was precisely the Decretals of Isidore. They claimed that the Pope had supreme authority over all Christians, including emperors, that the Pope could judge everyone, but was himself not subject to judgment, that the Pope's decisions were binding on everyone without exception. Of course, in the real history of the early Church, there was nothing like this. The popes of the first centuries did not claim the power to depose emperors, but Gregory sincerely believed in the authenticity of the Decretals and acted in accordance with them. Excommunication had devastating consequences for Henry. The German princes, already dissatisfied with the strengthening of imperial power, used excommunication as a pretext for rebellion. They demanded that Henry repent before the Pope, threatening to elect a new emperor. Henry found himself in a hopeless situation. In January 1077, he made his famous pilgrimage to Canossa, where Gregory was staying. For 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow in front of the castle, begging for forgiveness. This was the greatest humiliation of secular power before spiritual power. Gregory finally accepted his repentance and lifted the excommunication, but the conflict did not end there. It continued for many years with varying success. Henry captured Rome twice, and Gregory died in exile. But in the long run, victory remained with the papacy. The Church defended its independence from imperial power. This victory would have been impossible without the ideological weapon provided by the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. They gave the popes confidence in their right to oppose the emperors. They convinced the bishops of the need to submit to Rome. They shaped public opinion by presenting the papal claims as a restoration of ancient rights rather than a seizure of new ones. In an era when legitimacy was determined by antiquity, reference to supposedly ancient texts was a decisive argument. The reform affected not only the relationship between the Church and the state. Gregory and his successors carried out profound internal reforms. Discipline among the clergy was strengthened, compulsory celibacy was introduced for all priests, and control over appointments to church positions was tightened. Bishops had to report regularly to Rome, undergo inspections by papal legates, and carry out papal instructions. The Church was turning into a centralized monarchy with the Pope at its head. Here, too, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore played a key role. They justified the Pope's right to interfere in the affairs of any diocese, judge any bishop, and overturn the decisions of any council. In the real history of the early church, local churches enjoyed considerable autonomy. But the Decretals portrayed centralization as the original norm, and the reformers of the 11th century perceived their actions not as an innovation, but as a return to forgotten ideals. Resistance to reform was significant. Many bishops did not want to give up simony, which brought in large revenues. Priests resisted the introduction of celibacy. Kings and princes did not want to lose control over the church. But the reformers were fanatically convinced of their righteousness. They saw themselves as fighters for the purity of the church against the forces of evil. And the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore reinforced their confidence with the authority of the supposedly ancient Holy Fathers. Interestingly, some provisions of the Decretals that protected the rights of the accused were now being used by the reformers themselves. Bishops accused of simony or Nicolaitan referred to the Decretals, demanding multiple witnesses and the right to appeal to the Pope. The weapon created to protect episcopal independence was turned against them, but the reformers learned to use the Decretals selectively, applying some provisions and ignoring others depending on the circumstances. The struggle for investiture lasted for half a century. After the death of Gregory VII in 1085, his cause was continued by his successors, Urban II, Paschal II, and Calixtus II. They negotiated with emperors and kings, seeking to abolish the practice of secular investiture. The negotiations were difficult, accompanied by wars and excommunications, but in the end, the Church got its way. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 recorded the compromise between Pope Calixtus II and Emperor Henry V. The emperor renounced investiture with the ring and staff, symbols of the bishop's spiritual authority. From then on, bishops were elected by the clergy and confirmed by the Pope. The emperor retained the right to be present at the elections and to grant the elected bishops secular power. Landholdings. It was a compromise, but a compromise in favor of the Church. Similar agreements were reached with the kings of France, England, and other European countries. By the middle of the 12th century, the Church throughout Western Europe had become independent of secular authority in spiritual matters. This was a tremendous change that altered the entire structure of European society. And at the heart of this change lay, among other things, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. The reform also had its dark sides. The strengthening of papal power led to the creation of a centralized bureaucratic machine. The Roman Curia became a complex administrative apparatus with numerous departments, officials, and courts. Appointments to high ecclesiastical positions became the subject of bargaining and intrigue. The papal treasury was replenished by numerous levies on churches throughout the Catholic world. A new type of corruption arose, not feudal, but bureaucratic. The centralization of the Church under the authority of Rome caused growing discontent in various countries. The English, French, Germans, and Spaniards were outraged by papal interference in their national church affairs. Kings tried to limit the power of papal legates and appeals to Rome. Gradually, the idea of national churches took shape, which would later play a role in the Reformation, but that was still a long way off. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the papacy reached the height of its power. Popes Alexander III, Innocent III, and Gregory IX were effectively the rulers of Christian Europe. They deposed emperors, appointed and removed kings, organized crusades, and judged heresy. Their power was based on a ramified administrative apparatus, a developed legal system, and the ideology of papal absolutism. and this ideology drew its arguments from the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. It can be said that the Decretals were one of the instruments that created the medieval papal theocracy. Of course, there were other factors: economic, political, cultural. But without the legal justification provided by the forged texts, the papal claims to absolute power would have looked much less convincing. The 9th century forgery became the foundation of a political system that lasted for several centuries. The irony of history is that the authors of the Decretals probably did not seek such global consequences. They were solving local problems of the Frankish bishops of the mid-9th century. They wanted to protect the bishops from metropolitans and kings. They did not plan to create a papal theocracy, but their creation proved to be such a powerful ideological weapon that it was used for purposes they had not imagined. This often happens in history. A tool created for one purpose serves a completely different one. The Gregorian reform changed not only the Church, but also the whole of European society. The conflict between the Empire and the papacy gave rise to new political ideas. Theories emerged about the independence of secular and spiritual authorities, the limits of their powers, and the rights of subjects. These discussions became the basis for the development of European political thought. And at the heart of many of these discussions were provisions dating back to the Decretals of Isidore. For example, the idea that there are laws to which even rulers must submit, that the power of the monarch is not absolute, but limited by divine and natural law, that subjects have the right to resist tyranny. These ideas, which later became the basis of European freedom, were partly rooted in medieval ecclesiastical political disputes. And these disputes were conducted in the language of canon law, much of which came from a 9th century forgery. Thus, a forgery created to protect the corporate interests of bishops inadvertently contributed to the development of ideas about the rule of law and limited power. History is full of such paradoxes. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore became an integral part of university education. Canon law became one of the main disciplines in medieval universities, alongside theology, Roman law, and medicine. Students from all over Europe flocked to Bologna, Paris, and Oxford to obtain a doctorate in canon law. This degree opened the way to a career in church administration, bringing prestige and a good income. Canonists were in demand everywhere, at the papal court, in episcopal curias, and in royal councils. The basis of the training was Gratian's Decretum, created around 1140. This massive work systematized all the ecclesiastical law known at that time. Gratian collected about 4,000 texts from various sources, arranged them by topic, and attempted to reconcile the contradictions between them. Much of the material came from the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore, although Gratian did not always clearly indicate his sources. For students, all this was simply ancient canon law, without distinguishing between genuine and fake. Studying the Decretum took years. Students had to memorize hundreds of canons, understand their meaning, and learn to apply them to specific cases. Teaching was conducted using the lectio method, reading the text with commentary. The professor read a fragment from the Decretum, then gave detailed explanations, explaining terms, pointing out connections with other texts, and discussing possible interpretations. Students wrote down these explanations in the margins of their manuscripts. This is how the famous glosses came into being. comments that gradually surrounded the text of the decretum on all sides. Some glosses were brief, 1 or 2 words explaining a term. Others were lengthy legal arguments that took up more space than the text itself. The most authoritative glosses were copied from manuscript to manuscript and became standard. The common gloss emerged, a canonical set of comments that was studied alongside the text itself. Professors of canon law were influential figures in universities. They received high salaries, enjoyed respect, and their opinions were cited in court decisions. Some became bishops or papal advisors. Their commentaries on texts from the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore gained almost as much authority as the Decretals themselves. A tradition of interpretation developed in which layers of interpretations were superimposed on each other. Students did not simply memorize texts. They participated in disputations, formalized debates in which they had to defend or refute certain theses. The topics of the debates often concerned provisions from the Decretals. Can the Pope be wrong? Can one appeal against a papal decision? Must a bishop obey an unjust order from a metropolitan? Students learned to construct arguments, cite authorities, and find loopholes in contradictory texts. This scholastic training of the mind was a characteristic feature of medieval education. It developed a certain type of thinking, formal, logical, and based on authority. Truth was not discovered through observation or experiment, but was deduced from the correct interpretation of authoritative texts. Among these authoritative texts, the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore occupied an important place. Generations of lawyers were educated on a forgery without knowing it. Universities produced hundreds of doctors of canon law every year. These people spread throughout Europe, occupying key positions in church administration. They became officials, judges of episcopal courts, vicars, deputies of bishops in legal matters, members of the papal curia. Everywhere they applied the knowledge they had acquired at university. And this knowledge included the provisions of the Pseudo-Isidore's Decretals as indisputable truth. The papal curia was in particular need of qualified canonists. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Rome became the highest court of appeal for the entire Western Church. Thousands of cases were appealed to the papal court from different countries. Specialists were needed who were able to understand complex legal conflicts. Universities trained such specialists. Many young doctors began their careers in the Roman Curia, where they could have a brilliant career up to the rank of cardinal. The popes themselves were often experienced canonists. Pope Innocent IV taught canon law in Bologna before his election to the throne. He wrote an influential commentary on papal decretals, which was studied in universities. Pope Boniface VIII was an expert in canon law and actively used legal arguments in his conflicts with kings. These lawyer popes perceived the decretals of Pseudo-Isidore as part of a legitimate tradition and did not subject them to critical analysis. University teaching of canon law was practical in nature. Students had to learn how to solve real legal problems that they would encounter in their careers. Professors analyzed specific cases, showing how to apply the canons to complex situations. What should be done if a bishop is accused of heresy? How should one proceed if two candidates are vying for the same position? Can a king be excommunicated if he refuses to obey the pope? When analyzing cases, texts from the decretals were constantly quoted. Students learned to find the right canons, interpret them correctly, and combine them to achieve the desired result. It was not an abstract science, but the practical art of legal argumentation. And this art was based, to a large extent, on forged texts that everyone considered authentic. Interestingly, university professors sometimes noticed contradictions and oddities in the texts from the pseudo-Isidore Decretals. One decretal said one thing, another said the opposite. The style of some texts seemed suspicious. Events were mentioned that did not correspond to the known chronology, but these observations did not lead to the conclusion that the texts were forged. Contradictions were explained by the mistakes of copyists or differences in circumstances. The oddities of style were attributed to the peculiarities of the era. Medieval science did not know the critical method of analyzing sources. There was no concept of anachronism, no philological tools for dating texts. If a document looked ancient and was attributed to an authoritative author, that was enough. The idea of systematic falsification seemed unthinkable. Why would anyone forge dozens of papal letters? What was the benefit? Medieval scholars could not imagine the scale and sophistication of the deception. By the 13th century, Gratian's Decretum had become so authoritative that it was almost impossible to criticize it. It was a fundamental text on which the entire system of canon law was based. To question the Decretum was to undermine the foundations of the Church's legal order. And since a significant part of the Decretum came from the false Isidore's Decretals, they received additional protection through the authority of Gratian. The popes continued to issue new decretals, authentic letters containing answers to legal questions. These new decretals were collected as additions to Gratian's Decretum. Collections such as the Decretals of Gregory IX, the Decretals of Boniface VIII, and others appeared. They were studied in universities on a par with the Decretum. Thus, a body of canon law was formed in which authentic papal messages from the 13th century coexisted with forgeries from the 9th, and no one could tell the difference. The university environment gave rise to a special type of intellectual, church lawyers, for whom law was a science, an art, and a profession. They prided themselves on their mastery of canonical texts, their ability to find the right canon for any situation, and their skill in constructing convincing legal arguments. They were professionals of the highest order, but professionals who worked with material, much of which had been fabricated by unknown forgers. It can be said that medieval legal science was a brilliant edifice built on a false foundation. Lawyers were intelligent, educated, and logical. Their methods of analysis were sophisticated. Their arguments were convincing. But many of the source texts they worked with were forgeries. This does not detract from their professionalism, but it does show the limitations of the medieval scientific method. The influence of university teaching of canon law was enormous. It shaped the legal culture of all of Western Europe. Ideas drawn from the decretals of Pseudo-Isidore spread through university graduates throughout the Catholic world. They influenced legislation, judicial practice, and administrative procedures. They shaped ideas about justice, law, and legality. And all of this was based, to a large extent, on a carefully fabricated lie that no one questioned. The first serious doubts about the authenticity of the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals arose only in the 15th century. For more than 600 years, the forgery remained undiscovered, serving as the basis for canon law and papal policy. What changed in the 15th century? New methods of studying texts appeared, along with a new attitude toward antiquity and a new culture of criticism. The era of humanism began, an intellectual movement that that revised attitudes toward the classical heritage and medieval tradition. Humanists studied Greek and Latin texts with a new attention to language, style, and historical context. They compared different manuscripts of the same work, identified errors and interpolations, and restored the original text. They learned to distinguish authentic ancient texts from medieval forgeries. This philological culture slowly spread from Italy throughout Europe, and sooner or later it was bound to clash with the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. The first to publicly question the Decretals was Nicholas of Cusa, one of the outstanding minds of the 15th century. A philosopher, mathematician, astronomer, theologian, and church reformer, Nicholas was a cardinal of the Catholic Church, but that did not prevent him from taking a critical look at church tradition. In 1433, at the Council of Basel, where the question of church reform was being discussed, Nicholas presented a treatise criticizing certain provisions of canon law. In this treatise, Nicholas pointed out contradictions and anachronisms in the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. He noted that the style of some texts did not correspond to the supposed era of their creation, that institutions and concepts that arose much later were mentioned, that sources were cited that could not have been available to the authors. Nicholas did not directly claim that the Decretals were a forgery, but he questioned their complete authenticity. The reaction of the church hierarchy was predictably hostile. Criticism of the Decretals was perceived as undermining the foundations of canon law and papal authority. Nicholas was accused of insolence, disrespect for tradition, and dangerous innovations. His treatise was ignored by the official church. Most of his contemporaries preferred to stick with what they knew rather than rethink the fundamental principles of church law. The time for radical criticism had not yet come. But Nicholas of Cusa paved the way for other researchers. In the mid-15th century, the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla conducted a brilliant analysis of another famous forgery, the Donation of Constantine. This document, included in the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore, claimed that Emperor Constantine had transferred power over the western part of the Roman Empire to Pope Sylvester. The donation served as a justification for the secular power of the popes in Italy and their claims to political supremacy. Valla showed that the Donation of Constantine was a crude forgery. He analyzed the language of the document and proved that the Latin text did not date from the 4th century, but from the 8th or 9th. He pointed out anachronisms, references to realities that did not exist in Constantine's time. He ridiculed the absurdity of the content. Why would the emperor give half of his empire to the pope? Valla's treatise on the Donation of Constantine became a model of philological criticism and exposure of forgeries. Valla's work had an explosive effect. If the Donation of Constantine was a forgery, what could be said about other ancient documents justifying papal claims? Suspicion also fell on the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. If forgers had falsified one document, why couldn't they have falsified dozens of others? The logic was inexorable, but the official church was in no hurry to admit the obvious. At the end of the 15th century, the Spanish canon Antonio de Rosmini undertook a systematic study of the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals. He compared them with authentic ancient texts, studied the historical context, and analyzed the language and style. His conclusion was unequivocal. Most of the decretals attributed to the early popes were forgeries from a later period, probably the 9th century. Rosmini wrote a treatise in which he set out his arguments in detail. But Rosmini's treatise was not published during his lifetime. The church authorities did not want a public scandal. Admitting that a significant part of canon law was based on forgeries would have undermined the authority of the church at a critical moment. The 15th century was a time of deep crisis for the church. The Great Western Schism had only recently ended. The Avignon captivity of the popes had left a heavy mark. The conciliar movement demanded restrictions on papal power. In these circumstances, exposing the Decretals would have been a disaster. Nevertheless, rumors about the forgery of the Decretals spread in academic circles. Humanists discussed the problem in private letters and conversations. Many intellectuals understood that Nicholas of Cusa and Valla were right, but publicly criticizing the Decretals was dangerous. The Church could accuse the critic of heresy and subject him to persecution. Therefore, criticism remained muted, cautious, hinting, rather than directly accusing. The situation changed radically with the beginning of the Reformation in the 16th century. Protestant reformers were not bound by church censorship and could speak freely. For them, exposing the false decretals was a powerful weapon in the fight against the papacy. If the foundations of papal power were based on lies, then that power itself was illegitimate. This was a strong polemical argument which Protestants used to maximum effect. Martin Luther repeatedly referred to the falsity of the decretals in his writings. He claimed that the popes were deceiving Christians by relying on false documents, that the entire system of papal power was built on the sand of lies, that it was necessary to return to the true ancient church, as it was before the papal distortions. Luther was not too discerning in the details of his scientific criticism, but his polemical pathos was effective. For ordinary people who read his pamphlets, the picture was clear. The popes were lying, so they could not be trusted. Other Protestant leaders, Zwingli, Calvin, Melanchthon, also used the argument about the falsity of the decretals. They wrote treatises in which they analyzed in detail the anachronisms and contradictions in the texts. They showed that many of the provisions referred to by Rome had no basis in authentic antiquity. They contrasted the false tradition of the papacy with the true tradition of Scripture. Criticism of the decretals became a common theme in Protestant polemics. In the 1540s, the German Lutheran theologian Matthias Flacius Illyricus undertook a systematic study of church history from a Protestant point of view. His monumental work, The Magdeburg Centuries, presented the history of the Church through the centuries, criticizing Catholic distortions. Flacius devoted many pages to exposing the falsehood of the decretals of Isidore, providing detailed evidence of their falsity. The Catholic Church found itself in a difficult position. On the one hand, the scientific arguments of the critics were convincing. Many Catholic scholars privately acknowledged that the decretals were indeed a forgery. On the other hand, it was impossible to admit this officially. Too much had been built on these texts. For too long, the Church had used them as the basis of its power. Public admission of the forgery would undermine the Church's authority at a time when it desperately needed to be strengthened. Therefore, Catholic apologists chose a defensive tactic. They argued that critics were exaggerating the scale of the problem, that not all of the decretals were forgeries, that even if some of the texts were not authentic, the ideas they contained were in line with the true tradition of the Church. That form was less important than substance. It was a weak defense, but there was no other. The Council of Trent, which took place from 1545 to 1563 and defined the Catholic Church's position in response to the Reformation, cautiously sidestepped the issue of the Decretals. The Council did not recognize their falsity, but neither did it insist on their unconditional authenticity. An evasive formulation was adopted, allowing for various interpretations. The Church preferred uncertainty to openly acknowledging an inconvenient truth. But in the academic world, the question was effectively resolved. By the end of the 16th century, most educated people, both Catholics and Protestants, knew that the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals were a 9th century forgery. There remained disputes about the details: who exactly created them, for what purpose, and how much they influenced the development of the Church. But the fact of the forgery no longer raised serious doubts among those who studied the issue impartially. The exposure of the Decretals was part of a broader process: the emergence of critical historical science. Humanists and Protestant scholars developed methods of analyzing sources that formed the basis of modern historical criticism. They learned to date texts by language and style, identify anachronisms, and distinguish between genuine and fake. These methods, developed on the Decretals and other medieval forgeries, became standard tools of historical science. Thus, the greatest ecclesiastical forgery ultimately contributed to the development of science. The struggle to expose it forced scholars to improve their methods of source criticism. The history of the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals became a textbook example of how forgeries can be detected even centuries after their creation. The final exposure of the false Isidore Decretals took place in the 16th and 17th centuries thanks to the systematic work of Protestant and independent Catholic scholars. The methods of textual criticism developed by humanists were applied to the Decretals with relentless consistency. Every text was analyzed, every date checked, every stylistic turn studied. The result left no room for doubt. The researchers were faced with a grandiose 9th century forgery. David Blondel, a French Protestant theologian and historian, published his seminal work, Pseudo-Isidore and Turpin Unmasked, in 1628. In this book, Blondel applied all the achievements of historical criticism to the Decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. He compared them with authentic texts from the same era and showed striking differences in language and style. He identified anachronisms, references to facts and institutions that could not have been known to the alleged authors. Blondel proved that the Latin of the Decretals corresponds not to the early centuries of Christianity, but to the Carolingian era of the 8th and 9th centuries. He showed that the legal terms and concepts used in the Decretals only appeared in the 9th century. He discovered that many quotations from the Bible are taken from the Vulgate, a 4th century Latin translation in a version that only came into being during the Carolingian period. Every detail pointed to the 9th century as the time when the forgery was created. Particularly convincing was the analysis of historical errors in the Decretals. The forgers attributed to the popes of the early centuries knowledge of events that occurred centuries later. They put references to councils that took place after their deaths into the mouths of ancient popes. They made the popes quote documents written by their successors. These anachronisms were obvious to a 17th century historian who had access to chronological tables and critical editions of sources. Blondel also studied the manuscript tradition of the Decretals. He traced the history of their distribution and showed that the earliest surviving manuscripts date from the middle of the 9th century. No traces of the Decretals' existence in earlier times have been found. They appear suddenly, already in finished form, which is characteristic of forgeries. Authentic ancient texts have a long manuscript history with many early references. The Decretals have no such history. Blondel's work made a strong impression in the academic world. Protestant authors enthusiastically accepted it as definitive proof of papal deception. Catholic scholars were forced to acknowledge the strength of his arguments. Some tried to defend the Decretals, but their objections became weaker and weaker. The scholarly battle was effectively won by the critics. In the 1680s, the brothers Balus and Mobilian, French Benedictine monks and distinguished scholars, undertook a new study of the Decretals. They were Catholics and had no polemical goals against their own church. They were interested in historical truth, and they, applying the rigorous methods of paleography and diplomatics, the sciences of ancient manuscripts and documents, confirmed Blondel's conclusions. Mabille developed scientific criteria for determining the authenticity of medieval documents. He studied the shape of letters, methods of abbreviation, writing materials, and dating formulas. He created a methodology that allowed him to determine with high accuracy the time and place of a document's creation. Applying this methodology to the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals, he accurately dated them to the 9th century and localized their origin to Frankish lands. Mabille's work was particularly significant because he was a respected Catholic monk, not a Protestant polemicist. His conclusions could not be dismissed as biased. Even the Roman Curia was forced to reckon with his authority. Gradually, a tacit recognition of the fact of forgery took shape in official Catholic circles, although public statements remained cautious. By the end of the 17th century, a consensus had been reached in the scientific world regarding the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals. They were recognized as a forgery created in the middle of the 9th century in the Frankish kingdom, probably by church lawyers involved in the conflict between bishops and metropolitans. Disputes remained about the details, the exact place of creation, the identity of the authors, and the degree of their conscious intent to deceive. But the fact of the forgery itself became universally recognized. In the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals became a symbol of obscurantism and deception, which, according to the Enlightenment thinkers, characterized the medieval church. Voltaire repeatedly mentioned the Decretals in his writings as an example of how religious institutions manipulate the ignorance of the masses. Edward Gibbon, in The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, devoted scathing pages to the Decretals, portraying them as an instrument of papal despotism. The Enlightenment thinkers, however, often exaggerated the scale and consequences of the forgery. In their portrayal, the false Isidore's Decretals became the cause of all the misfortunes of the Middle Ages. This was a simplification. The Decretals were a tool in the hands of various political forces, but they were not the only or main cause of the conflicts of that era. Nevertheless, the image of the greatest ecclesiastical forgery became firmly established in popular historical literature. In the 19th century, with the development of scientific history, the study of the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals continued on a new level. German historians Georg Parz and Paul Hinchius undertook critical editions of the texts of the Decretals. They collected all the surviving manuscripts, compared them, restored the original text, and provided it with detailed commentary. These editions remain the basis for the study of the Decretals to this day. In his 1863 study, Heinsius analyzed in detail the sources used by the forgers. He showed which authentic texts had been reworked, which fragments had been added, and what changes had been made. He reconstructed the method of the creators of the Decretals with the precision of a forensic expert. Thanks to his work, we know not only that the Decretals are a forgery, but also how exactly this forgery was created. At the beginning of the 20th century, French historian Paul Fournier studied the influence of the pseudo-Isidorian Decretals on the development of canon law. He traced how texts from the Decretals found their way into various canonical collections, how they were quoted by popes and councils, and how they shaped the legal practice of the Church. His work showed that the influence of the Decretals was even greater than previously thought. Virtually, the entire system of medieval ecclesiastical law bears their imprint. Contemporary historians continue to study the pseudo-Isidore Decretals, but from a different perspective. They are less interested in the moral assessment of the forgery, and more in its historical role. The Decretals are seen as an important source for understanding the mentality of the 9th century, the church politics of the Carolingian era, and the evolution of ideas about power and law. The forgery has become a valuable historical document, bearing witness to its time. Some historians are also revising their assessment of the motives of the creators of the Decretals. Perhaps they were not cynical deceivers, but sincere reformers who believed they were restoring a lost truth. Perhaps their methods were unacceptable from a modern point of view, but understandable in the context of medieval culture. This does not justify the forgery, but it does make it more understandable as a cultural phenomenon. The exposure of the pseudo-Isidore Decretals was an important milestone in the development of historical science. It demonstrated the need for a critical approach to sources, the development of rigorous methods of authenticity verification, and the rejection of blind trust in authority. The methods developed in the fight against this forgery are still used by historians today. In this sense, the Decretals served science, albeit unintentionally. The history of the exposure also shows how difficult it is to acknowledge an inconvenient truth when it undermines established ideas. It took the Catholic Church several centuries to openly acknowledge the fact of the forgery. Even when the scientific evidence was irrefutable, official recognition was delayed. This is a lesson about the power of institutional inertia and the difficulty of change even in the face of obvious evidence. The Catholic Church's reaction to the exposure of the pseudo-Isidorian Decretals was complex and contradictory. Official recognition of the forgery took several centuries. At first, the Church categorically rejected criticism, then moved on to evasive wording, and only in the 19th and 20th centuries did it fully acknowledge the facts. This long and painful process shows how difficult it is for institutions to admit mistakes, especially when it comes to the foundations of power and authority. In the 16th century, at the height of the Reformation, when Protestants actively used the argument of the forgery of the Decretals, the Catholic Church took a tough defensive position. Official apologists claimed that critics were exaggerating and distorting the facts, that the Decretals were mostly authentic, and that some questionable texts could be explained by scribal errors, that even if individual documents were inauthentic, this did not affect the truth of church doctrine. Cardinal Roberto Bellarmine, one of the leading Catholic polemicists of the late 16th century, devoted a special treatise to the defense of the Decretals. He acknowledged that some texts were questionable, but argued that Protestants were drawing unjustified conclusions from this. According to Bellarmine, the authenticity of individual documents is less important than the truth of the tradition they represent. Even if the form is not authentic, the content corresponds to the spirit of the Church. This argument was weak from a scientific point of view, but psychologically understandable. To admit that a significant part of canon law was based on forgery would have meant undermining the foundations of church authority at a time when that authority was facing an unprecedented challenge. It was easier to deny the obvious than to revise centuries of tradition. The Church chose the tactic of minimizing the problem and delaying recognition. The Council of Trent, which defined the Catholic Church's position in response to the Reformation, did not make a direct judgment on the Decretals. The Council confirmed the authority of Church tradition as a source of faith on a par with Scripture. It strengthened papal authority and centralized Church governance, but it did not specifically address the question of the authenticity of the documents on which this authority was based. This was a tacit acknowledgement of the problem without any willingness to resolve it. In the 17th century, when scientific evidence of forgery became irrefutable, the official position of the Church began to change. Catholic scholars appeared who openly acknowledged the fact of forgery. The Ballus and Mobilian brothers, while remaining devoted sons of the Church, honestly presented the results of their research. Their work was approved by the Church authorities, which was a sign of a changing attitude. But the recognition remained cautious and gradual. Official documents avoided direct wording. Instead of acknowledging the forgery, they spoke of questionable texts, insufficiently verified documents, and later interpolations. Such terminology allowed them to save face without denying the obvious, but also without making categorical statements. It was a diplomacy of words, hiding an uncomfortable truth behind vague formulations. An important moment was the publication of a new code of canon law in the 19th century. In 1917, the Code of Canon Law was published, replacing the medieval collections. The new code did not include texts from the pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. This was a de facto recognition of their unreliability. The Church refused to rely on forged documents without making any loud statements. But the transition to a new legal system did not mean an admission of past mistakes. The official position was that canon law had evolved and improved. The old sources had lost their relevance not because they were false, but because new, more complete and systematic codifications had appeared. This version allowed the Church to avoid uncomfortable questions about why it had relied on forgeries for centuries. The Second Vatican Council of the 1960s carried out a profound reform of the Catholic Church. The Council reviewed many aspects of Church life, renewed the liturgy, and opened the Church to the world. There are no direct references to the pseudo-Isidore Decretals in the documents of the Council, but the general spirit of the reforms implied a critical attitude towards medieval tradition. The Church distanced itself from much of what had characterized it in the past. In modern Catholic historiography, the pseudo-Isidore Decretals are described openly and honestly. Catholic historians acknowledge the fact of forgery and analyze their origin and influence without apologetics. In official Church publications, encyclopedias, and seminary textbooks, the fact of forgery is presented as a historical given. This shows that the Church has finally been able to accept this uncomfortable truth. However, this recognition has raised new questions. If the Decretals were forged, What does that say about the institution that used them for centuries? Does this mean that papal authority, based on false documents, is illegitimate? These questions remained acute for critics of the Church. Catholic theologians responded that the legitimacy of Church authority was based not on legal texts, but on divine institution and apostolic succession. A reassessment of canon law was a necessary consequence of the exposure. Church lawyers had to rethink the foundations of their discipline. What norms remain in force if their historical justification has been proven false? The answer was found in the concept of living tradition. Even if the historical roots of some norms turned out to be fictitious, the norms themselves could be confirmed by centuries of church practice. A custom that has lasted for centuries creates law regardless of its origin. This was a pragmatic approach that allowed the continuity of the legal system to be preserved. The Church did not abandon all the principles originally justified by the Decretals, but now these principles were based on practice rather than on fake ancient texts. This was more intellectually honest, although it meant acknowledging that many medieval claims to antiquity were illusory. The influence of the Decretals on the modern Church is minimal. The new Code of Canon Law, revised in 1983, contains no references to medieval sources. Church law is now based on the decisions of the popes of the 19th and 20th centuries, the documents of the Vatican councils, and modern theology. The false decretals of Isidore are a thing of the past, of interest only to historians. But the memory of the decretals serves as a reminder of the danger of an uncritical attitude toward tradition. The Church has learned its lesson. One cannot build doctrine on unverified historical claims. Modern Catholic theology seeks to rely on reliable sources, recognizes the limitations of historical knowledge, and rejects claims to possess absolute truth about the past. The consequences of the exposure of the pseudo-Isidore decretals were profound and multifaceted. They affected not only the Church, but also European culture as a whole. The exposure became a catalyst for the re-examination of the medieval heritage, contributed to the development of critical historical science, and influenced the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. This was one of those cases where the discovery of deception changed not only perceptions of the past, but also the reality of the present. For the Protestant Reformation, the exposure of the decretals became a powerful ideological weapon. Martin Luther and other reformers used the fact of forgery to discredit papal authority. If popes had relied on false documents for centuries, how could their claims to spiritual leadership be trusted? If the foundations of canon law were fictitious, why should Christians obey church laws? These arguments were convincing to the masses. Protestants contrasted the false tradition of the papacy with the authentic authority of Scripture. Only the Bible, they argued, is a reliable source of faith. Human institutions, even ancient ones, cannot compare with the divine word. The exposure of the decretals reinforced this argument. It showed that church tradition was not as ancient and reliable as claimed. Much of what was considered eternal had in fact been invented in the Middle Ages. The consequences for the Catholic Church were painful. The Counter-Reformation sought to restore the authority of the Church that had been undermined by the Protestants. But how could tradition be defended when an important part of it turned out to be false? Catholic theologians were forced to rethink their arguments. They began to appeal less to the antiquity of specific documents and more to the continuity of church life. It was not written texts, but the living tradition of the Church that became the main argument. The Council of Trent strengthened the position of Catholicism, but failed to eliminate the problem of the Decretals. The Council confirmed the importance of tradition, but carefully avoided the question of specific sources. It was a compromise solution that allowed the Church to save face, but did not solve the problem in essence. The shadow of the Decretals continued to hang over the Catholic Church's claims to absolute power. The exposure contributed to the secularization of European society. If the Church could be wrong on such fundamental issues, perhaps its authority was not so absolute. Perhaps reason and critical inquiry were more important than blind faith in tradition. These ideas, reinforced by the exposure of the Decretals, fueled the Enlightenment movement of the 18th century. Criticism of religious obscurantism often relied on the example of medieval forgeries. In the long run, the exposure changed the Church's attitude toward history. Catholic historians learned to be more critical of their sources. A school of church history emerged that strove for scientific objectivity. Bollandists, Maurists, and other Catholic scholar monks developed rigorous methods of historical criticism. They were not afraid to acknowledge errors and forgeries in church tradition. This was a healthy development, albeit one forced by external criticism. The influence of the Decretals on the development of law turned out to be paradoxical. On the one hand, they were based on lies. On the other hand, they contributed to the formation of important legal principles: the protection of the rights of the accused, the requirement of evidence, the right to appeal. All of this was present in the Decretals. Although the historical justifications were false, the principles themselves became part of European legal culture. Their false origin did not diminish their significance. Modern historians see in the Pseudo-Isidore's Decretals not only a forgery, but also an important source for understanding the medieval mentality. The Decretals show how people in the 9th century imagined the ideal church, what problems concerned them, what solutions they considered correct. The forgery became a window into the medieval world of ideas about power, law, and tradition. In this sense, it gained new value for historical science. The lessons of the Decretals are still relevant today. They remind us of the dangers of uncritical acceptance of authority, that even the most venerable traditions can have dubious origins, of the need to check facts, even if they have been sanctified by centuries. That truth is more important than convenience, and that admitting mistakes is a sign of strength, not weakness. The historical significance of the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals goes far beyond church history. It is one of the most successful deceptions in human history. Created in the 9th century, the forgery remained undiscovered for more than 600 years. It influenced the development of law, politics, and culture in medieval Europe. It played a role in the greatest conflicts of its time, and even after its exposure, it continues to be a subject of study and a source of lessons. Why was the forgery so successful? The first reason is technical perfection. The forgers were highly skilled professionals who knew their stuff. They skillfully imitated the style of ancient texts, used authentic fragments, and created plausible details. Their technique was so sophisticated that it was almost impossible to detect the deception without advanced tools of textual criticism. The second reason was that they met the expectations and needs of readers. The Decretals told people what they wanted to hear. Bishops found in them a defense of their rights. Popes found in them a justification for their authority. Reformers found in them arguments for change. Everyone could find confirmation of their ideas in the Decretals. This made criticism psychologically difficult. People do not want to doubt what confirms their beliefs. The third reason was the authority of antiquity. Medieval consciousness was deeply conservative. The new aroused suspicion, the ancient aroused trust. The Decretals were presented as the voice of time-honored tradition, as the wisdom of the early centuries of the Church. In an era when there was no critical historical method, reference to antiquity was an almost irrefutable argument. The forgers exploited this feature of medieval thinking. The fourth reason was institutional support. The Church, as a powerful institution, had an interest in the Decretals. They strengthened its power, expanded its authority, and protected its interests. Institutions have enormous inertia and the ability to defend what is beneficial to them. Even when doubts about the Decretals arose, the Church long refused to acknowledge them. Institutional interest hindered the search for truth. There are many lessons to be learned for understanding medieval culture. The Decretals show how differently medieval people viewed authorship, authenticity, and truth. It was normal for them to attribute their ideas to ancient authorities. The line between reconstructing what was lost and inventing something new was blurred. Truth was understood not as conformity to fact, but as conformity to a higher design. It was a different type of consciousness that requires understanding, not condemnation. Modern research on the Decretals uses the latest methods. Computer analysis of texts allows stylistic features to be identified with unprecedented accuracy. Comparing thousands of words and constructions provides a statistically reliable picture of authorship. The study of manuscripts using modern technologies, radiocarbon analysis, spectral analysis of ink, digital image processing, opens up new possibilities for dating and localization. Historians continue to argue about the details. Who exactly created the Decretalia? Was it one group or several independent forgers? What were their exact motives? How aware were they that they were creating a forgery? These questions remain open. Perhaps the final answers will never be found. The authors of the forgery covered their tracks well, but the main significance of the Decretals is not in the details of their origin. They show how texts create reality, how words, even false ones, can change the world. The Decretals were not a reflection of church history. They became an instrument for creating it. They did not describe papal power. They helped to build it. This is a lesson about the power of discourse, about how ideas, clothed in a convincing form, become a material force. The history of the Decretals also shows that truth ultimately prevails. It took 600 years, but the forgery was exposed. Critical thinking, patient research, and an honest search for truth broke through the wall of lies. This is an encouraging lesson. No matter how sophisticated the deception, no matter how much institutional support it enjoys, sooner or later the truth comes out. Finally, the Decretals remind us of the need for humility before history. We never know the past completely. Our sources are incomplete, often distorted, sometimes false. Any historical reconstruction is conditional and subject to revision. This is not a reason for skepticism, but a reason for caution. We must check our sources, seek confirmation, and recognize the limits of our knowledge. The history of the Pseudo-Isidore Decretals is an excellent lesson in historical criticism.